Yeah, it should come in a second, hopefully. Goodness gracious, this is so confusing. Because it's like Google, but with YouTube too. Okay, let's get rid of it. Dang it. I just X'd out of a thing I probably needed. You haven't gotten it yet? Huh? Okay. Okay, well, I'll just let you go and then you just need to go work out. Oh. Okay. I don't understand why this has to be so confusing. I know. Well, I guess I'll just let you go, and whenever you get it, if it's working, call me back or something and let me. Sent items. Yeah, it says it's sent. It might have gone to your spam or something since it's just a web link. It did have a subject, but it was only a link. No, you don't have to do that. Me too. I think just from stressing so much. Wes, it is that big of a deal. And I can't remember. Did I send you the YouTube link?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Am I waving or is it delayed or? Okay, so I think it's delayed a little bit, but that's fine. Can you, well, I guess you don't know if you can hear me or not. I'm waving. Huh? No, I can't. Okay, but you can hear everything and you can see it. Okay, well then I'll just leave this up. I just won't even stop the broadcast and I'll just send this to my dad. And now you've got the link, so. Okay, that'll work. Yep. I know. I'm just still scared. Okay. Okay. Whew, okay. Okay. Yeah. I just get worried about disappointing people. Okay. I'm gonna try. Yeah, please come get me. Ooh. Okay. I guess I should probably try to get something to eat for lunch. Yeah. Okay. 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 I got it. Okay. Thanks, baby. Thanks. Okay, that sounds good. I just have my laptop set up. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I might try to do that if I can figure it out. Yeah. Good. I wish I was there to share them with you. Dang, Wesley. Doing good. I wish. None. I can tell you right now, it's not either of those. Yeah, I know. I know. I know that stuff too. Okay. Okay. All right. I love you too. Okay. Bye. I think I'm streaming this room right now. Because I just didn't shut it down. Because I sent the link to Wes, and it seems to be working. So I think you can just get, I think it posts it to YouTube and you can watch it with this link. But I think it's delayed a little bit.
Can you send me that link? And I'll look.
Yes.
Maybe Amanda can come over and sit.
Yeah, have Amanda sit in.
She's in the math department.
Yeah, she's a lecturer. Oh my gosh, this day. Where are you going? Oh yeah, I forgot your brother was here. I need to get lunch at some point, I think. Yeah, but I might just run out and go get something. Yeah, I did some stress baking this morning. I baked a lot of things. Yes. Did you get the link? Oh, then yeah, it's definitely the link. Can you hear anything? All right, I think we got it. Everyone's on lunch. All right. Thanks, Whitney. Thanks for looking at that and seeing if you could figure it out. Sounds great. See you soon. We just don't have anyone blocking too much of the
You can ask for what he's doing. Doctor's going.
everyone we're streaming with, that no one.
Yeah. There's nobody to eat your big things.
I know, I did a little bit of stress baking this morning, I think. Baked 3 different things. Yeah, I printed one out for me.
You need one.
Should we go print you guys out?
That would be awesome.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm sharing it. A link will probably bring.
They probably have printed one. I didn't look. I've read it.
Yeah, you've read it a few times.
You need a receipt?
Nope. It's
When we have a room upstairs.
well, Dan had reserved the conference room across the hall,
Okay.
and so then we were like, well, we can just move to the thing over here. That'd be well. Yep. I did well so far.
Oh, you are broadcasting this thing?
Yep.
Cool.
So that Wes can watch it. And my dad.
Huh. This webcam has surprisingly larger angle.
Well, I think it's back so far.
So everyone is going to
Hmm?
So everyone is going to
Yeah, her back from there. But I don't know what to do. What do they need? What? Don't say no.
Time to eat your lunch.
Yeah, no. That's a bad idea to go. I'm stressed.
Right.
God, I still gotta open all this stuff up. I got see if the thing works. Okay. My wrap's really good here. Don't open the sodas, they are gross.
They're out.
Yeah.
I was thirsty.
You can have some apple juice.
The rest of the group coming? Oh, Rebecca's not.
Well, now Holly's gone,
Holly's, oh, that's true. Holly's gone now.
and I don't know if Kate's made it back from the airport yet.
I think Kate just made
No,
it back.
I just saw Kate upstairs.
Okay, so Kate's probably gonna be.
Whitney will probably be there.
Whitney will be. She's here. Joey is. Joey's fine. Joey's recovering from surgery.
This morning Kate was like, I think I can make it back for Eric's presentation. And I said, why? She said, because Dr. Bogan's flight doesn't leave until 1 o'clock or something. And I don't know if I should announce it.
You want to put up any posters?
Sure, why not? Add some decoration. Yeah, that's okay.
Should I put up some flyers? Was there any flyers?
I haven't done all week, so I have no idea. I don't think we're- That's like-
Yeah. And everyone's probably tired of trying to talk, so.
I'm not.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I invite a couple of my friends?
Hmm?
Do you mind if I invite a couple of my friends?
If you invite them,
Yeah.
sure, if they want to come listen to me blab about stuff for a while.
Yeah, they just wanted to see what actually presentation looks like.
We only get to see what you.
Yeah. I'll just-
A lot of other countries, they actually have the candidate walk across the gap across campus. Before the defense committee falls behind them, walk in behind them or out. I think that's supposed to be the actual thing, you know. not just like-
What if you don't have?
Markers?
There was one here.
Yeah, let's make sure it works.
Looks not good. Yeah, it works.
You want another color?
It looks like there might be a black one behind you.
Oh, okay.
And the projector.
Great. The projector's not turning on, is it on already?
No, I had to try to turn it on. Oh, is this one?
No, I just wanted to.
I had somebody tell me, oh, I know, well, what's the guy's name? Hold on.
Oh, it's crooked. Or no, it's just too big.
Yeah. Want to do that. Building the presentation.
I haven't heard his name. West I don't know. He's in Cross the whole time. You probably would. They do a ton of turf work.
He says he knows this. He hasn't worked with them. He had some interesting comments like that.
About what?
Just in general about the situation.
Oh.
He's put
Oh, yeah.
Is it like,
No, I don't think there's anything more than 2 years, I think, would be. Oh, Joey just texted me. Oh, it fits.
Yeah, but I think there's it's kind of,
Oh, is that triangular?
yeah. That was
Oh, yeah. Then, yeah. Um, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great. Did you miss anything?
Not yet.
Why not?
Did you make the muffins?
I made everything. I did some stress baking this morning.
Did you sample?
No, I feel sick that I don't eat
No
it.
stressy. Oh, you
Just
say,
stress baking.
you're going to drill when you.
I should.
You call me if they're done about some.
That's okay.
That's good stuff, I think.
I didn't. I didn't travel like. I don't want to share. Mine's all electronic.
I printed that for him, so
Oh, okay.
don't give him too much credit.
Oh, well, mine's all electronic, so my comments I can either email or you can grab it off the flash.
Muffins?
Yeah, those are accompanied with chocolate chip.
What are these?
Do you want me to print you out a copy? No. Doesn't, you know, you can just say, call it good. Yeah, everyone's welcome up here. The sodas were dropped, but I think they're okay.
Boy, really want me to.
During the presentation.
Have a presentation.
I think it was okay. I don't know, I didn't feel
Sorry, I
fantastic
missed
about it.
Huh.
I'm gonna stand back while you do that. It was like, I don't know, 15 minutes. It should be okay. No, he's there.
I
On the
was.
Computer,
Well,
yeah,
one of
he
you
said it
just-
kept buffering, I don't know if you can hear us.
How's the driving state?
You know that my grandma passed me this cake?
Interesting fact of the day.
I'm not sure how I feel about that. You did know. I think she just did. I'm sure.
I'm so glad that you're.
Yeah. My grandma.
This is perched. So. Well, Wes is watching. And my dad.
Hopefully, Dan.
And hopefully Dan. You can whisper to Wes.
Yeah. All this stuff right across the
I think that should be okay.
Is he watching right now? I could introduce myself.
Yeah, you should say hi to him. He can't say hi to you. You can say hi to him.
There's like a 5-minute delay.
Yeah, so in a couple minutes.
Hi, I'm
This is
Kate.
Kate.
You did it on like, what did you say? It was on.
It's on Google
Oh,
Hangouts.
it is.
And then it posts it to YouTube. It's like weird. They're pumpkin, if you're wondering.
No, I know. I just don't know it.
You made your yourself?
Huh?
You made yourself?
Yes, I did some stress baking in the morning.
Doctor was on as soon as we got off the highway. She was like, let's roll down these windows. Smell the Oklahoma air.
Did you last all the way back to the airport?
I tried to get
Oh,
things
my
here,
God.
like.
You gave me life lessons.
There was one where it was
Dan Thomas. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's starting in January.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was at Chase again in January 13. Okay, I didn't know when you were. Yeah. I said, no.
It's a fountain horse person.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not afraid of fountain.
I did that once. Physics lecture.
You were the Outdoors president? Or you created a program right after? Like for the lecture, or was this an extra bonus?
It was on accident. Extra bonus.
No.
Oh, okay, I was gonna say.
Oh, like you're gonna say this, or that's really gross.
It was so awkward because everyone in
That's how I wrote it. All right, you ready?
my. They're very innovative.
Like, it's really gonna let her down.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thanks, guys, for coming. This feels like it's about my 100th presentation that I've watched this week. All right, one more to go and we get break. The best one today. Okay, good. The best, no, the best one, it will be today.
Oh, okay.
Just right now. So, you guys probably, I think everybody here knows Erin. Graduated from Clemson, came to their master's degree, and decided to stay into a PhD. What you're going to see, and what I asked Erin to do today, is she's really got 5 chapters to her dissertation. One's been published, and with the Superior Paper Award winner. 2 more have been submitted, or in the review process, and should be, fingers crossed, accepted very soon. They've already had review comments back in. And there are 2 more chapters that we haven't submitted yet. So what I asked her to do is, instead of boring you with, this is chapter 1, let's try to give us a more of a 30-minute overview of the whole thing in one story. So we'll see how it goes.
if I can do it.
Let's see if you can do it.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. I wanted to welcome everyone else on my committee here, Dr. Balut from Civil Engineering and Dr. Sherry Hunt from the USDA ARS Hydraulics Lab. I'm sure most of us know Dr. Hunt. And then Dr. Storm is sick today, so hopefully he's watching from home. And okay, so the big overarching theme of my PhD project was quantifying fluvial resistance of stream banks using jet erosion tests. As Dr. Fox said, I'm not going to go through a lot of the methods that we used or anything like that. I really just want to give you somewhat a state of the knowledge on cohesive soil erosion that we have found through doing some of these projects. So why is this important? The U.S. has over 40,000 impaired water bodies, and Oklahoma alone has 700 of those. And the number one, in most cases, the number one cause of that impairment is sediment loading that can also contribute to nutrient loading, pathogens, and other problems. Some studies have shown that anywhere from 50 to up to 85% of the sediment loading in these streams can come from stream bank erosion. So being able to quantify stream bank erosion to get a sediment yield prediction is really essential for us to be able to manage these watersheds well and to come up with TMDL recommendations. So a brief overview of how stream bank erosion works. There's three main mechanisms that contribute to stream bank erosion. The first is subaerial erosion that you can think of as a weakening of the bank. It's basically erosion that occurs from wetting or drying processes, freezing or thawing, things that just really weaken the soil structure and can either cause direct erosion or indirectly cause erosion. Fluvial erosion is actual particle detachment by the river flow. So when the river stage is interacting with that soil surface, the shear stress of the flow can cause particles to detach. This is a continuous process when it's happening and can be indirectly related to subaerial erosion because subaerial erosion can kind of be a preparatory process for fluvial erosion to occur. And then mass wasting, which is basically a force imbalance in the stream bank where we have large masses of soil failing and falling into the stream, contributing to that sediment load. So these three processes can typically be seen in a cyclical process, if we're really going to simplify it, where subaerial processes kind of weaken the bank and get it ready for more susceptible for fluvial erosion. Once the fluvial erosion occurs, then we have undercutting of the bank, and that can cause mass wasting. So these are three really interconnected processes, but the main focus of my project was on the fluvial erosion component. So that's what we're really going to be focusing on for the rest of my presentation, but definitely keep mass wasting and definitely subaerial erosion or subaerial processes in mind as we go throughout this presentation. So the most common way that we predict and model fluvial erosion in any kind of stream bank erosion modeling is with the excess shear stress equation, where we can calculate the erosion rate of the stream bank by looking at the erodibility coefficient, KD, times the difference in shear stresses, so the excess shear stress that's put on the bank. So tau is what the river is actually applying, that shear stress that it's applying to the bank, and tau C is our critical shear stress, which is basically how much the bank can stand. So you can think of the critical shear stress as that point at which erosion will actually start, and then once it actually starts, that erodibility coefficient basically tells us how fast that soil is going to fail as it continues to be put under a higher shear stress than it can stand. So these two parameters, these two erodibility parameters, KD and tau C, are really important as inputs into these models or inputs into this equation. So getting a good handle on how to measure or estimate these parameters for specific soil at a specific site is really, really important for making these erosion rate predictions. So one way that these two parameters are estimated is from empirical equations that have been developed over time. Typically what's done is the critical shear stress is related to some kind of soil property, whether that's texture, bulk density, and moisture content. One of those physical soil parameters can usually be related empirically to the critical shear stress. One that's most commonly used in a lot of models such as SWOT and as user inputs into other models such as VSTEM is the Julian-Torres relationship that calculates the critical shear stress based on the silt clay content. That SC% is the silt clay content of the soil. Once we get an estimate of the critical shear stress, users can usually, it's either built directly into the model or the user can use this as input, estimate the KD from another empirical equation. There hasn't been much success in relating KD to any kind of soil physical parameters. So typically what's used is equations that relate the critical shear stress to KD. So Hansen and Simon has put out a very popular relationship that's used in a lot of models relating KD to tau C. And then Simon has since updated this relationship with the use of a more robust data set to come up with a slightly different equation. So these are the three main equations that we see either built directly into models or that in the literature people are using to get this input to then put into these predictive modeling scenarios. Another way that you can do it, if you don't want to estimate it empirically, you can actually measure these parameters in situ using the jet erosion test. There's a couple of other tests that can be used to measure these parameters, but this is the easiest one to do actually at the site. So it measures these two erodibility parameters, and it's basically just based on the rate of scour and the velocity of a jet of water that you're shooting into the bank. So this is a picture of the actual apparatus. This is a lab setup. Typically what we'll do when we take this out to the field, this blue ring will be stuck into the stream bank. The jet will be connected to that ring, and then we use a nose pressure head and shoot a jet of water straight into the stream bank, and then we can measure the progression of that scour depth over time. So using all that information, we can then derive those two erodibility parameters. There's a little bit of a schematic on how that works. If you all have questions about the theory and everything behind the jet, please feel free to ask me anytime, but I don't have time in this presentation to go through that. So with the jet, there's basically the original solution technique that was put out. This apparatus was designed actually here in Stillwater at the USDA Air Hydraulics Lab. When they designed it, they actually put out a spreadsheet to go with it to help you derive these parameters. And the method that it used, we call the Glidesdale method, where the critical shear stress is just based on the point when the scour depth hole reaches equilibrium. This was initially designed to be used on earthen dams or compacted soils. So when they first started using this, that time for that scour hole to reach equilibrium was typically very, very large. So one thing that they did in order to not have to go out and run a jet test for days on end is to basically estimate that critical shear stress based on a hyperbolic logarithmic function which Glidesdale had put forth. So they basically used the equilibrium scour depth, which is JE. From there, you determine a critical shear stress, and then you can iteratively solve for an erodibility coefficient from there. But what our research team had noticed was that using this method doesn't always converge to a reasonable solution. And here's an example of that. So this is a plot of the dimensionless scour depth, J star, versus the dimensionless time, T star. And you can see that our jet data doesn't really fit too well to that line. So we started looking into other solution techniques. And there's basically two other alternate solution techniques that are out there right now. The first is the scour depth solution, and it basically just simultaneously, iteratively solves for tau C and KD in order to minimize the error between the observed data and the actual excess shear stress equation. Another solution that's been put out is the iterative solution by Simon et al. And it likewise solves for tau C and KD at the same time, but it tries to minimize the error between the measured time to reach the equilibrium scour depth and the time that you would expect it to take to reach the equilibrium scour depth. So both of these solutions are not really new or novel. They've actually suggested in the original literature when the Glidesdale solution was put out. But I think that the computational powers of Excel during that time were not such that two parameters could be solved for at the same time. So they went on to other methods, and we've since seen that these two methods tend to fit the data a little bit better. So here's an example of that. I know you can't see the numbers, but you can see that the data generally follows that shape of that dimensionless scour curve a lot better than the original Glidesdale solution did. And you can see the different parameters that we get from these different solution techniques as well. scour depth solution and the iterative solution tend to, from all the jets that we've seen, tend to come up with similar critical shear stresses that are typically much higher than what would have been given to us with the Blithedale solution. And also typically greater erodibility coefficient. And the scour depth solution typically gives a little bit of a larger scour erodibility coefficient than the iterative solution does. So definitely keep that in mind too as we move through this presentation. And you can see that if we look at our actual data, looking at the scour depth of that hole over time, we can see that the solution techniques using the scour depth solution and iterative solution actually fit that data a lot better too than what would have been predicted with the Blithedale solution. So basically, these new solutions definitely need continued testing, and a lot of the empirical relationships that have been developed to be used in these models were based on the Blithedale solution. So with these new solutions, those empirical relationships really need to be revisited. One thing that has come out of this project is that we were able to create an automated spreadsheet where the user can just input their jet data and click a button, and all three solution techniques are used, and the solutions are displayed for the user to use at their discretion. And that's been really successful, and it's gone out to a lot of people so far. So now that you have kind of a background of what the jet is, what it can do, and stream bank erosion in general, some of the current issues that we're seeing right now in the field is basically that determining these two erodibility coefficients or erodibility parameters are really difficult to predict, whether you're using empirical relationships or jet measurements. Typically, when we go out to a site, we'll take 3 jets and we'll conduct 3 jets and then take the average and use that as our input value into our model. Based on trying to figure out which is, if these things are lining up and if we're really accurately measuring these things or predicting them as for use in these predictive models. Also, once we do determine these parameters, using them appropriately in order to improve stream bank erosion and watershed management, whether it's through field studies or process-based modeling, we just want to make sure that we're actually getting accurate estimates of these parameters, especially considering that up to 85% of the sediment yield in a watershed could be attributed to stream bank erosion. So as I said, these erodibility parameters are really difficult to measure. Most of us in here have worked with soil before, or if not with soil, indirectly with any kind of environmental variables. They're not very easy to follow. There's a lot of variability. So this can be due on a stream bank due to soil heterogeneity. There's a spatial scale that needs to be considered, and possibly even a temporal scale. We typically think of soil properties as being the same over time. The soil is the soil, not changing. But what we've started seeing is that these erodibility coefficients, even though they are soil properties, they can change with time. So that's something that needs to be considered as well. All of this kind of to say that there could be a very large range of variability of erodibility parameters. So we decided to take kind of a look at that. And we started by looking at that at a watershed scale. So some of these models, especially models like SWAT, the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, do a watershed scale analysis. So we wanted to see what these erodibility parameters look like at a watershed scale, how much they actually vary. So we looked at the empirical relationships and we measured the parameters using jets. We wanted to look at the parameter uniformity, check the correlation between, if we could find any empirical relationships between measured soil parameters that we were finding and our jet results, and then look at the applicability of some of these currently proposed relationships. So we looked at the Illinois River watershed. We had 13 sites where we did anywhere between 3 and 6 jets at each of these sites. For all of our watershed scale variability stuff, those values were averaged to have a single set of parameters for each of these sites. So when we look at the parameter uniformity, we see a really large range in values on a watershed scale. So even though to us the soil looks uniform, it looks like I've got the same soil at this site as I do at that site, we're seeing that the erodibility parameters are not saying the same thing. So we can see anywhere from 2 to 3 orders of magnitude difference in the critical shear stress and the erodibility coefficient, depending on where you are in that watershed and depending on what solution technique you're using. For this study, we just looked at the Blithedale and scour depth solutions, and so you can kind of start to see the differences in the solutions there. Okay, so what if we look at any correlations between our jet results and the measured parameters that we were doing in the field? Here we've got Spearman's Rho, which is just a way to look at the correlation between two parameters. They can range anywhere from -1 to +1, and at those two extremes, at -1 or +1, it basically means we have perfect correlation between those parameters. So you can see here that we didn't really have too much correlation between the critical shear stress and the erodibility coefficient and any of the measured soil parameters that we had, which included bulk density, the D50, and then the soil texture. We didn't have any significant relationships that pointed to any kind of correlation between these erodibility parameters and the measured soil parameters for either solution technique, the live soil or scour depth. So if we start looking at the applicability of some of the current relationships that are out there, we look at the Julian and Torres relationship that predicted tau C based on the silt clay content. You see that this does not do a very good job at all on the watershed scale of predicting the critical shear stress. In fact, it usually over-predicts the critical shear stress that could really lead to under-predictions in the erosion rates when we're trying to estimate these sediment loads. Some of the other relationships that we looked at that I haven't mentioned yet, but just wanted to show, this is a relationship looking at the D50 and trying to estimate the critical shear stress from the D50. Similarly, you can see that we're not getting a really good prediction based on what we measured with the jet. Another one measures, or excuse me, predicts the critical shear stress from the clay content. Same story here. We're not really getting a good prediction based on what the jet is telling us. And also notice that we're getting smaller ranges of values that are being predicted by these values, or by these relationships, rather than the range of values that we're seeing with the jet. Looking at predicting the erodibility coefficient, this is another relationship that I haven't shown yet, but it basically it predicts the erodibility coefficient from the clay content at a certain bulk density. So we plotted a bulk density of 1.5 or 1.9 and expected anything in that range, and we still did not see a very good correlation between what we measured and what this relationship would have predicted for us. And then looking at some of those, that Hansen and Simon-All relationships, and how they matched up to what would have been predicted in some of these models, we can see that the black dots are the Blithedale solution, and the white dots are the scour depth solution. We can see that those would not have lined up at all either. And again, it would have led to a very a gross under prediction of the erosion rate if we were to use these empirical relationships in the model rather than the measured data. So basically what we saw from the watershed variability study was that there was a large amount of variability of these erodibility parameters, and that the currently proposed relationships that are typically used weren't really appropriate for using in this watershed. A lot of these relationships have lacked validation outside of the watershed in which they were studied, and so we were really stressing the need for site-specific measurements. So then that got us to thinking, well, how much variability is there at a site scale? So at a watershed scale, it's a large scale. I would have expected to see variability, but if we go out and do a ton of jets at one site, would we see the same amount of variability? So that's what we did next. We went to 3 sites in the state, and remember I said that typically people will go out and that are measuring these parameters in situ, will go out and take about 3 to 4 jet tests, average them, and then use that number as input into their model. So what we did here was we went to each of these sites and tried to just do as many jet tests as we could in the small homogeneous layer of soil that was there. So at Barren Fort Creek, we ended up doing 30 jets there. At Cow Creek, we did 20 jets. And at 5 Mile Creek, we did 24 jets. So this is a much larger sample size than what is typically done at these sites. So then we did the same kind of analysis that we did with the watershed scale variability, but then did it at the site scale. So here's a graph of the soil textures that we found from each of these jets that we did, just to give you an idea of the soil textures that we were dealing with. They're pretty low clay content and had high silt and sand content. So we have a lot of sandy loams and silt loams. This is also to illustrate that although to us it looked like we were in a homogeneous soil layer, we actually saw a range in texture, even just from, jets that were done within a half a meter of each other. So that just kind of illustrates the point that we're getting a lot of variability at these sites. So we look at the variability in terms of the erodibility parameters. We can see that at the site scale, this is the Blithedale, scour depth, and iterative solutions now. At the site scale, we still get a large amount of variability in these parameters when we measure them. So we saw that big amount of variability at the watershed scale, and it doesn't look much better at the site scale. We're still seeing anywhere between 1 to 3 orders of magnitude differences in the erodibility parameters that we're deriving from these jet tests. Same thing happened at Cow Creek. Cow Creek was probably one that our site of the 3 sites that we characterize as our most erodible site. So we can see that there were much lower values of tau C and high values of KD. And at 5 Mile, we see the same thing. Again, a large amount of variability. And at 5 Mile Creek was probably our most resistive or least erosive site. And so we can see that there's quite a large range in the critical shear stress, especially with the Blithedale solution, and then still a range in the erodibility coefficient. We looked at correlations again to see if we could find one of these empirical relationships. Maybe these empirical relationships could be derived for site-specific measurements. This time we did find, this is Spearman's Row again, this time we did find some significant relationships. Those bars that are highlighted in red were significant at a p-value of 0.05. So this time the retail, since you all probably can't see it, the variables that we looked at included the x direction of the bank, so moving down the bank in a longitudinal direction, the y direction from top to bottom, the temperature of the soil, the temperature of the water, the bulk density, the moisture content, porosity, saturation, void ratio, and then a texture. So we see quite a few parameters. This is at the Barrenport Creek, just as an example, that seem to correlate with these erodibility coefficients for each of the solution techniques. But doing a linear regression on these parameters, and then doing a multiple linear regression with multiples of these parameters that were found to be correlated, none of them provided any kind of reliable relationship that could have been used. The R squared on most of these linear regressions were down in the 30s or 20s, and sometimes even lower. And sometimes some of the parameters that were found to be correlated using this technique were not correlated at all using a linear regression technique. So moving on to some of these empirical relationships, now we've got a much bigger data set with all of the jets that we've done across all 3 sites. And we can see that there's not much of a difference. We're still vastly over predicting the critical shear stress using silt clay content as a predictor. And same kind of story when we look at the erodibility coefficient as well. Those relationships that are being used currently in models are not matching up well with what we're measuring with the variability of each of these sites. We wanted to kind of look at the spatial variability as well to see if that had anything to do with it. You know, a lot of this is pointing to the fact that subaerial processes could be very important when considering these erodibility coefficients or parameters. And so the wetting and drying, freezing and thawing can happen differently at a different spatial scale across the stream bank. So plotting the critical shear stress on top and erodibility coefficient on bottom, in terms of its spatial scale, we can see some kind of interesting patterns that can develop. So here at Barrenport Creek, we saw that most of our higher critical shear stresses were towards the top of the bank. Towards the top of the bank, you started getting into the root zone. So this could also point to the fact that the moisture dynamics that happen within the root zone could have an effect on the critical shear stress, or the roots themselves could have an effect on the critical shear stress. So there's really a lot more that can be done with investigating this kind of spatial and temporal scale on the erodibility parameters. As I said, a lot of these empirical relationships are based on a texture type relationship. Everyone's trying to say, okay, if you have a sand, you should expect this type of critical shear stress, something of that nature. So I just wanted to point out, if we contour the texture of the same bank, you can see that the texture doesn't really match up well with the patterns that we're seeing in the erodibility parameters. So again, this kind of points to the fact that there's some kind of spatial variation that could have something to do with the severial processes that are happening in a different space and time scale, rather than just pointing towards texture. So from this study, we saw there was definitely a large amount of variability at the site scale. Again, there could be spatial or temporal relationships that could be investigated. So that kind of got us to thinking, well, for projects before, we've gone out, we've just done 3 jets on the site and taken the average. So how many jets would we really have to do in order to characterize the bank now that we have a better idea of what the variability is of these 2 parameters? And this could be used to provide guidance regarding the number of samples needed to accurately characterize stream banks and work towards more of a working standard on how many you should do. So there are statistical methods to calculate the number of samples required for a given confidence. If we assume that these parameters follow a normal distribution, then we can calculate the the number of samples needed based on the standard deviation of our samples. And that delta value is basically a margin of error. So if I want to calculate the critical shear stress to within 1 Pascal, then that delta would be 1. However, most environmental variables don't follow a normal distribution. So if we assumed instead that it followed a log normal distribution, we could still calculate the number of samples required based on the standard deviation. But this time we're using a p-value instead of delta, and that p is a percentage. So now instead of going within plus or minus 1 Pascal of the critical shear stress, I'd be calculating the sample size required to get within 5% of the true critical shear stress for that bank. So just keep that in mind as we move through these next few slides, that delta and p are not really directly comparable. Delta has units and is an actual value, whereas p is a percentage. So what we saw, first I wanted to see, okay, if we went out to the bank and did what we have been doing, we went out and did 3 jets or 5 jets, so 3 is on the left and 5 is on the right, and took an average, then how close would we be at these banks when we did this? So we can see that up top, we're assuming a normal distribution, so that's within plus or minus that delta value. And we seem to be doing pretty well with 3 and 5 jets, relatively. One thing I did want to point out is that these can be different depending on the erodibility of the site. Remember I said that Cow Creek was our more erodible site and 5 Mile was our less erodible site. With that, 5 Mile being our less erodible site, which means that critical shear stress is a lot higher, we saw a much larger delta for a given number of jets for the critical shear stress, whereas with Cow Creek, where our erodibility coefficient was much higher because it was more erodible, we saw a much larger delta for a given number of jets there. So these are really dependent on that range of values that you're going to be seeing as well. If we move down and we're expecting a log normal distribution, which is more of what we would expect rather than a normal distribution. And keeping in mind, again, these are percentages now instead of a delta value. We can see that we are pretty far off on a lot of our sites. We see the same kind of pattern that we discussed up here. But in a lot of cases, this number is over 1, meaning that we're, for example, at Bear and Fort Creek with 3 jets trying to find the critical shear stress with the lifestyle solution, we're off by 182% from what the true mean is. So doing just 3 and 5 jets with the variability that we're seeing at these sites is not really giving us a good estimate of what the true mean could be at that site as input into our model. So just looking at, okay, well, we went out and did however many jets at each of these sites. It was 30 for Bear and Fork, 20 for Cow Creek, and 24 for 5 Mile. Just going out and doing those and using that information and saying, okay, if I wanted to find the true critical shear stress to plus or minus 0.1 pascals or plus or minus 5 centimeters cubed per second for the kV value, how many jets would I have to do on these sites in order to get that kind of confidence at a 95% confidence interval? And we can see, depending on the site, we can have a lot of jets that we need to do. At Cow Creek, using the live depth solution, we only need to do 2 jets so we can be that confident in our solution. But at the same time, if we're using the iterative solution at that site, we would need to do 36 jets And you can see some of the other sites, especially 5 Mile with that critical shear stress at a resistive site. We're not going to fit in 12,000 jets, and I'm not going to do 12,000 jets at a site because that would take a long time. For the log normal distribution, we see the same kind of thing. Again, now we've moved to percentages. So at a 95% confidence interval, if I wanted to be plus or minus 5% for both my erodibility parameters, I would need to do anywhere between 90 and a few thousand jets at each of these sites in order to get that confident and that close to what the true mean is. So from all this, we saw that determining sample size depends on the solution technique that you're using, the parameter being estimated. A lot of times, since those KD values are a lot higher magnitude-wise than the critical shear stress, a KD could require a lot more samples than what you would need to accurately predict a critical shear stress. The degrees of precision and confidence required, which we don't really have a good handle on what type of confidence and degrees of precision are needed and as inputs into these models, sensitivity-wise. And then also the presence of spatial and temporal dependency. So doing this kind of sample size exercise doesn't take into account any kind of spatial or temporal dependency. That's for a snapshot for that bank, for that particular location at that particular point in time. So that's something that needs to be considered too. So basically saying that there's more research that needs to be done in order to provide more guidance on how to conduct these tests, how many you need to do. So these checks, doing 3 or 4 at a site, and these empirical relationships that we've gone over are currently being used in predictive modeling, even though we've seen through all of this how far off some of these estimates can be, or how variable even the measured estimates or the measured parameters can be. So we wanted to look at kind of a modeling scenario. Another thing we mentioned before is vegetation. There's a lot of unknowns with the effects of vegetation on these erodibility parameters from a modeling standpoint. And as we discussed, these parameters could have spatial or temporal variability, which means that in most of the models that we use right now, in fact, in all the models that we use right now, we're modeling potentially dynamic parameters statically. So we put these inputs into the model. They stay the same. Even if I'm running a 10-year simulation, that coefficient staying the same the whole time. And what we're seeing is that maybe that might not be the case. So in a modeling type situation, we modeled 10 sites along Bearport Creek. 7 of these sites were historically protected. 3 sites were historically unprotected with respect to the vegetation that was on the stream bank. We modeled them using the bank stability and total erosion model. And this simulates fluvial erosion and mass failures. So remember from that process from the beginning of the presentation, none of the models really take into account severial erosion right now, but this does take into account both fluvial and mass wasting. For the fluvial erosion, it does use the excess shear stress equation. And this is a 1D model, meaning that it's just at one site and it can only move in one direction. So one of the things that we had to do to account for other parameters and other variables going on was to calibrate this model with an alpha factor that basically artificially increased the erodibility coefficient and decreased the critical shear stress in order to simulate different kind of erodibility situations. So what we saw from this model, just looking at aerial imagery, which we used to do the calibration of this model, we saw that the protected sites definitely retreated or eroded a lot less than the unprotected sites, saying that vegetation probably is helping keep those banks in place. When we were looking at how our model performed, looking at the measured retreat using the aerial imagery versus the model retreat from BSEM, we see that our model did a really good job and lined up basically on the one-to-one line really well. Some of the outliers occurred at some of the unprotected sites where we had larger magnitude events that came through, and so I don't think that BSEM was able to keep up with that kind of retreat. The big thing I want to say from this modeling exercise is that our calibration did focus on that alpha value, so it focused on changing the fluvial erosion portion of the model. In terms of the vegetation on the bank, the root cohesion, vegetation is usually incorporated into models by increasing the root cohesion. in order to add more strength to the bank so that mass failures don't occur. There's nothing that incorporates vegetation in terms of the fluvial resistivity. So what we found doing this is that the root cohesion didn't really have any kind of a factor on whether on our calibration process, and didn't change whether those banks were going to retreat or not. And again, our calibration really only focused on that alpha factor. So with this, there's a couple things we can say from that, is that that alpha factor is kind of a lumped calibration factor, but it includes possibly the influence of vegetation, also the increased shear stresses on river meanders. This is a 1D model, so the increased shear stress on a river bend is not being incorporated. And then also this alpha factor might be taken into account the temporal and spatial variability of those erodibility parameters. Again, these were static parameters, and we've seen from some of our variability studies that they might not be static in both the spatial and temporal sense. Another thing that we pulled from this modeling exercise is that typically if a process-based model isn't being used in order to estimate retreat, usually 1 or 2 year studies will be done, even 3-year studies where you go out and monitor a bank, see what's going on. And what we saw is if we look at our modeling output in terms of 1, 2, or 3 year critical study periods that would have typically been done, we see that there's a lot of variability from year to year, from study period to study period. And when you do this exercise, or for how long you do it, really gives you a different output in terms of the erosion rates that you're predicting. So long-term simulations of bank retreat are really needed in order to capture the retreat rates over a range of different stresses that are put on the bank. If I go out there 1 year and it's a dry year, I might not see much retreat. But if I went out there in a wet year or in a year with a more dynamic hydrologic regime, then I might see a lot more retreat than what I would have seen just by going out and seeing it in person rather than doing a process-based model. So models are definitely, I think, needed for that purpose, but there's definitely a lot of more research that needs to be done in order to quantify the effects of riparian vegetation so that it can be incorporated into these models, quantifying the variability of the erodibility parameters, and either moving towards a two-dimensional model or incorporating the time-dependent alpha. So doing this modeling exercise, we see that we go through a really intensive calibration in order to get these models to match up with what we're seeing on the aerial imagery. So it kind of points to the fact that we're missing some of the parameters that we need, and they're kind of being lumped into that alpha calibration value. And this might be, again, due to the effects of vegetation that aren't quantified, the effects of the burial processes that aren't quantified, and things of that nature. So some general conclusions that we've seen from all of these projects. For the solution techniques, the scour depth and iterative solutions definitely provide an improved fit to the data, and the automated spreadsheet that we've made from there with these techniques has been a success so far. It's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years if we start getting feedback on how these parameters are behaving in models. The differences between utilizing these different solution techniques will definitely help. In terms of variability at both a site and a watershed scale, we basically saw that the empirical relationships that are currently being used really weren't working for our system, and I would expect not for a lot of systems outside of the system that it was developed in. So site-specific measurements are definitely necessary. However, we have seen a large amount of variability in our measured parameters as well. Again, we saw a lot of spatial and possibly temporal variability, and a lot more research needs to go into quantifying this variability so that we can incorporate it into these process-based models as well. As far as modeling goes, definitely quantifying the role of vegetation, quantifying the effects of the burial processes, again, to try to reach that point where we can incorporate these variables into these models, and possibly incorporating dynamic erodibility parameters where you don't just input one set of parameters and let it run for 10 years. It can change with time depending on whatever variable we might find that is most influential on changing those parameters. So my recommendations moving forward, so there's definitely many unknowns left to answer in terms of soil erosion and modeling. If you need something to do, definitely go into the field of cohesive soil erosion. There's a lot left to do. I think that the big areas of continued research need to be on how these new solution techniques are working, variables in how jets are operated, and how sensitive the derived parameters are to those, quantifying the variability of parameters in both the spatial and temporal scale, and seeing how they relate to some of these scenario processes, and then incorporating some of these parameters more dynamically into process-based models. So, with that, I went really fast. I hope you all caught something. I definitely wanted, I'm going to run through these acknowledgements really quick because otherwise I'll probably cry and no one wants to see that. I definitely want to thank my advisor, Dr. Fox, for so many things. I'm not going to go into it because I will cry. My committee members, Dr. Storm, who's not here, Dr. Hunt, and Dr. Balut, you all have been immensely helpful in getting through this and being really patient with me in getting through this so quickly. Some of the graduate students, Holly and Anish, have both been amazing. They've been awesome, coming out and doing so much work for me, like a ton of work. Rob Miller really helped me while he was here as a postdoc. Joey and John have both come out to the field. Whitney, Rebecca, and Kate have really amazing. They didn't really help me that much with my project, but they helped me completely sane in the grad office when I got really stressed. My undergraduate student, Derek's come out to the field to help do a bajillion jets, which is not a lot of fun, especially when it's cold. And Abigail has just been beyond amazing and helping us get a lot of our lab work done. Definitely my parents, who have no idea why I'm getting a PhD or what I'm going to do with it, but have supported me either way. And then Wes, who I'm not going to talk about for quite a lot. He's been awesome too. So with that, I'll stop crying and then answer questions. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I wasn't going to cry.
We have to answer the question.
I know. That's when I'm really going to cry. If y'all have any questions, if you could keep up with anything I was saying, because I know I blew through that really fast. So if you need clarification on anything, please let me clarify too. Yes.
I have a question. So you're doing jet tests on things, say you do 100, okay? So what part of that distribution is the part that needs to use? What's important? Is it the median, the mean? Is it the most erosive part of it? Is that where it's going to go? Where on that distribution do you want to use?
That's a really good question, and I think that's one that I wouldn't feel, even with all the jets that I've done, I don't know if I would feel comfortable telling you what to use. I mean, obviously from an engineering standpoint, if we want to do a conservative kind of design, we would use the most erodible test or come up with some kind of mean that would give us a more biased mean towards the most erodible parameters. But I think there's still a lot of unknowns left to answer in terms of what solution technique are you using, what head settings did you use, what time interval did you use, and is that really sensitive to these parameters that are being derived? I think with the state of the knowledge right now, what we have right now without doing more research, I would probably say it kind of depends on the the calibration that you use. So a lot of times when we input these parameters into the model, like I said, we use that alpha factor. We end up getting so far away from the original parameters in order to model a long-term retreat rate that sometimes I was like, why did we even bother measuring this? Because we're so far off from the original parameters. I could have just calibrated it from my office instead of going out and doing 100 jets in the field. But I think that there's definitely still value in measuring these. That's not what I'm saying at all. But yeah, I think that that's one of the unknowns that there is still to answer. I don't know what to tell you about that one.
That actually kind of leads into my second kind of follow-up question from that is, based upon the variability you saw, what kind of sensitivity does that range have in the final result of the model? Is it relatively insignificant? Is it very significant? What do you think?
Right, so that kind of goes along with what I was talking about, especially, my only experience really has been with playing around with these parameters and V-stems. So I only have one model to go off of to give you this kind of answer from. But again, we end up calibrating it so much to take into account so many unknowns in using a 1D model and using a static variable that we get pretty far away from that original estimate. So, depending on what you would input based on the variability, I don't know that it would be that sensitive once you got to the modeling standpoint in VSTEM, based on the fact that it is a 1D model and you do have a lot more calibrations to do.
Some of those cross sections, though, alpha was 1. It suggests that we were using the original parameters. There were some you're right, on when we got a higher remainder ratio, higher sinuosity that didn't move away from there.
Right.
Some that were.
There were a few that had a lower alpha value of 1, that would mean that we're not changing those parameters at all. I think in those cases we still had to play around with the erodibility coefficient a little bit, and we did that independently of an alpha value to get to a measured retreat rate. But these were simulations that were done over a 10-year period, so keep that in mind too. I don't know if we had done it over a shorter term period, maybe it would have made a difference, but yes.
So the data show that you have variability. Would you develop a probability distribution and do Monte Carlo analysis at the end so you can see what your expected distribution would be?
Yeah, and we've considered moving into that direction. We haven't done that yet, but it would be interesting to compare that from site to site and see if we could get more of a recommendation like Dr. Vogel was talking about with that probability distribution. That might be something that we end up doing pretty soon here.
Talking about the solution techniques, said that Brazil doesn't really give us a reasonable estimation, right? But across those two solution techniques, we don't really use any statistical measure of goodness of fit of those three models to.
We do. I didn't present it in this presentation, but we use an NOF value, which I can't remember what it stands for. Normalized. I can't remember what it's called, but we normalize it, and I do have a table where we compare at least the blind scale and scour depth solution, and see that we get much smaller NOF values, showing us that we do have a better fit to the actual observed data in that case.
And talking about the variability of the test, I was wondering how they compare to the variability of soil properties itself in a site. So, for example, soil texture. There must be something which the test says, okay, in a given site, there is this much variability in soil texture.
Right.
How does that compare to the variability in the test?
I do have other plots that I didn't show here, looking at the variability of things like bulk density, moisture content, the texture, and we saw that those varied quite a bit at the site too. But one thing that we, showing that contour plot is that variability in some of those parameters doesn't necessarily match up with the variability of the erodibility parameters, if that makes sense. But you're right that the soil parameters do vary quite a bit as well at the site.
So, what do you think the variability is? I mean, what's the major factors that lead to that kind of variability?
In
The jet test?
the erodibility parameters, or the jet test, or?
Yeah, the variability factors.
I've been doing a lot of reading recently on the effects of subaerial processes. I think that could definitely account for a lot of it. And then there's variability in how the subaerial processes take place at a spatial and temporal scale at the bank as well. So, if I had to give an answer and I had to guess right now, I would say that I think subaerial processes probably account for any variability beyond the variability in the soil itself in the erodibility parameters.
Any other questions? We've got a
Cool.
couple
Cool. Dr. Thomas?
A lot of these soils, just looking at the soil here, doesn't have much structure in it. It's based on how it was put together and how it ended up being dropped there from whatever previous historical factors there. Are there any other microbiological factors that ought to be brought into this structure characteristic? Because when you look at stable soils versus ones that are unstable like that, there seems to be a lot more going on in the soil than just the texture of clay.
Right. No, and that's a really good point, and one that I didn't make in my presentation at all, that there have been studies that looked at both biological and chemical factors that can go into these as well, and studies that have looked at trying to develop empirical relationships based on the dispersivity of the soil, the different ions that are present in the water that you're using to jet into the soil, as well as the soil itself. There's definitely 10,000 other variables that could be going into this, so we just looked at the physical parameters. Brad, did you say?
So if you do your jets and you get your numbers for that shoreline or that stretch of the creek, and then you go 5 years and you check the model, and if the big event comes through and the shoreline completely changes, do you see that as having to go back out there in the jets again if you lose 5 feet of bank? And you need to, I mean, you could lose the composition of soil to change quite a bit in that amount of time.
Right.
So
So
something you would need to do to recalibrate the model based on.
I think ideally, yes. But typically, we'll go out and look at what's going on right now, and then we'll take that and run it for 10 years. So yeah, we're not capturing what could be going on farther back in the stream bank. There's assumptions that do have to be made in order to simplify this model and get some kind of usable numbers off of them, knowing when you get these numbers that there were assumptions and things of that nature. But yeah, ideally, I would think.
Is there a point where you can take the jet and the soil parameters from that spot and say, just go out and maybe do soil parameter tests and not have to do the jets over and over again?
At this point, I don't think so. So as we saw from a lot of my data at both the watershed and the site scale, we couldn't really see any correlations between what we were getting from the jet test and the physical parameters at least that we were measuring. So I don't think that just measuring a difference in soil parameters would give us an easy way to find a difference in the erodibility parameters.
last point now, and more like it. So Greg Hansen used to always tell us this is an order of magnitude. Right? So you may be looking at it at 5 centimeters per Newton or centimeters per meter per second. Now, this is really a 10 or 100 or 1,000 is what we're trying to do. How many tests would you have to do in that case?
I know you asked me to do this a lot, and I haven't. So there's really not a good way to do that using the equations that we have to find, especially once we look at a log normal. We reported the normal distribution knowing that most of these don't follow normal distribution. So especially with the log normal distribution, in order to get an order of magnitude difference with a percentage without knowing the true mean, it was really difficult to do. But I guess my comment on that is that definitely to someone who's not familiar with using the jet test, the variability that we showed does look like a huge amount of variability. And 3 orders of magnitude is still a large amount of variability, but you're right that these are seen on an order of magnitude type scale. So 3 orders of magnitude might sound a lot bigger than what it really is. And I think it's still an issue, but you're correct in saying that it is more of an order of magnitude type scale that we're looking at.
So if you take like the 30 jets you did for use the highest capacity and the lowest, what range of erosion being monitored?
That's a good question. So we didn't test that, and I would expect that that would be different for each model that you would use it in. So, you know, BSTEM does fluvial and mass wasting. So, you know, what happens fluvially can have a really big impact on what happens mass wasting wise. I don't know if there's a simple.
But for BSTEM would be like more 2 orders of magnitude difference.
Again, I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question, just because it's such a sequential type process that a small change at the beginning could add up to a very, very large change by the end of 10 years with the way that BSTEM handles the erosion. So I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question.
Any other? 5 mile creek, 5 mile 1 word or 2?
I asked Holly, I don't know.
Whenever I've seen it in the report, it's like a few in the hours for it.
Is it one word?
Holly had it spelled as one word.
Okay, then I should probably change it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure in the maps
It's one word?
it's always.
Okay. And
And here's another one. I was gonna say, I'm gonna throw that question. How do you spell Erin?
E-A-R-R-E-N.
Check your dissertation. I found one.
I didn't spell it that way though.
I think that the correct pronunciation of the one word is Fibonacci.
Oh, it's Fibonacci Creek. Sorry, I pronounced it wrong.
Writing out 5 looks like a smile with your nose too.
There you go.
At least with my writing.
You all are being immensely helpful.
That's just a little personal experience.
Any other questions?
Useful question.
Good. What was the comment by the poster? Was a wonderful.
Wonderful question. That was a perfectly wonderful question.
All right, if not, thank you guys for coming.
Sorry, I cried.
Superficially like my junior.
I do not think that. I have to look at it.
Ooh, my dad took me hard about crying. My dad's like crying during a doctoral district presentation.
Is he what?
Yes.
Who said that?
I need to turn that up. I told him he couldn't watch it really.
Oh, yes.
Bye, Dad.
Yes.